I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of Batman. I never read the comics, watched the cartoons, or any of the films pre-21st century. Sure, the Dark Knight trilogy is great, but those are movies that transcend the superhero genre and are incredible pieces of cinema that stand on their own, especially 2008's The Dark Knight. This may seem like a strange way to introduce a retrospective for a Batman video game, but I'm doing so to emphasize a point. Batman Arkham Asylum, much like The Dark Knight, is a game that requires no previous knowledge or interest in the Batman lore to enjoy. Before I played this game back in 2009, I knew nothing of Batman's backstory, and the only meaning that Bane had in my vocabulary was something burdensome, like how never getting to sleep with my history teacher was the bane of my existence. In that sense, I feel that someone like me is, in many ways, more qualified to judge the quality of Arkham Asylum than someone who collected the comics, watched all the cartoons, and could quote the movies off by heart. A non-Batman fan's ability to play through Arkham Asylum isn't simply a case of being able to tolerate the overwhelming presence of the DC universe in every nook and cranny of the game, because you actually find yourself being sucked into the lore and history of the world and its characters, through collectibles, audio logs, biographies, and through the game weaving these elements throughout its story. It's also a testament to the game's design and atmosphere, which draws parallels to the darker tone of the Dark Knight trilogy, that it keeps you hooked throughout, and actively encourages your interest in the asylum, its history, and its deranged inhabitants. Zsasz, Scarecrow, and Poison Ivy were all characters who I invested in while playing through the game, and characters I never gave a second thought about after completing it. The real star of the show, however, is the Joker. At the beginning of the game, the Joker is captured, a little too easily, and is brought to Arkham, a massive insane asylum housing Gotham City's most deranged and dangerous criminals, to be reincarcerated. Naturally, he escapes, which sets Batman on a manhunt to recapture him, which is essentially the impetus for the entire game. Much like the aforementioned lore, the Joker is ever present throughout all of Arkham. Having taken full control of the asylum, he regularly appears on the asylum's monitors and is constantly chiming in on the Tannoy system, barking orders at thugs, threatening to maim and kill people, and, of course, taunting Batman. Voiced brilliantly by Mark Hamill, he manages to toe the line brilliantly between being comedic, violent, and cartoonish, without ever veering too far into one or the other. Now separated from the staff and Commissioner Gordon, Batman finds himself all alone in Arkham Asylum. Pouring rain under the cover of nightfall, the game sets out to establish a dark tone from the get-go, something which it achieves in spades. As a location, Arkham is brilliantly realised. Maintaining this consistent tone throughout, the variety of locations on its grounds prevent it from becoming stale from a presentational point of view. From the gothic halls of the Arkham Mansion, to the sterile, blood-soaked pathways of intensive treatment, to the overgrown vertical stairways of the botanical gardens, each area maintains the same gothic dystopian aesthetic while offering enough visual and mechanical variety to keep things interesting. In that sense, the game draws a lot of inspiration from BioShock, one of the greatest games ever made, and the first game I actually ever reviewed. Although not quite the same quality as BioShock in terms of setting or as an overall game, it successfully recreates that sense of immersion, with the game's atmosphere suffocating you in the best possible way. The same atmosphere lends itself to the game's sense of freedom and exploration. While far from a sprawling world, the game's map isn't actually very big. The sense that you are trapped within Arkham's walls, an insane asylum essentially marooned from the rest of Gotham City, really immerses you in its world, making exploring it truly a joy. Arkham is made up of 3 main grounds, one to the west, the north, and the east, with each area containing 1 or 2 large buildings, as well as a litany of caves, towers, and other hidden areas. The beginning of the game establishes this immersion immediately. After the Joker's escape, he immediately takes control of the asylum, and locks the entrance back out of intensive treatment. The game does a good job of limiting Batman's movements, which simultaneously allows it to save certain locations for later story beats and unlockable items, while also allowing the player to feel like the detective Batman is by forcing them to adapt to their environment and figure out ways around obstacles, as well as upgrading and adding to their arsenal as the game progresses, to afford them access to heretofore inaccessible areas. It also forces Batman into combat situations. Immediately after Joker's escape, Batman is trapped in a tight room with half a dozen goons looking to kill him. This introduces us to the game's combat mechanics, which is perhaps the most pleasantly surprising thing about Arkham Asylum. Fundamentally, the combat system is fluid, clever, and very basic. Pretty much every offensive and defensive move is mapped to a single button. Triangle is used to counter, circle is used to stun opponents with your cape, X is used to dodge and roll, while all strikes, special combos notwithstanding, but we'll get to them, are mapped to square. There are moments in the game where you're literally faced with 20 enemies or more trying to fight you all at once, forcing you to dispatch of them with your bare hands. You would think, mechanically, the game would have to strike a balance between difficulty and feasibility when you're faced with a room full of enemies. Well, it doesn't, at least not really. The whole point of being Batman is the feeling of being, well, a superhero. Therefore, taking out multiple enemies is relatively easy. This is where fluidity and the cleverness of the game's mechanics comes into play. Most of the time, you're forced to face each enemy one at a time. Mashing the square button will quickly dispatch of most enemies in a head-on encounter, but this is where the game's most important combat mechanic comes in: the counter. While you're beating the hell out of one goon, the others will attempt to blindside you, which will trigger a counter prompt. Time it correctly and you'll intercept them, usually involving a beautifully over-the-top animation. Most of the time, it will take you 2 or 3 engagements to permanently knock out an opponent. However, if you successfully perform a ground and pound attack on a downed opponent, he'll get incapacitated immediately. Cleverly, these attacks take a fraction longer to complete, and leave Batman completely open to attacks, meaning you have to be strategic as to when you use them when being attacked by dozens of enemies. Time it right, and you'll eliminate one foe much quicker. Time it incorrectly, and you'll get blindsided, which not only chips away at your life bar, but interrupts the other key factor in the combat: your combo. In Arkham Asylum, you can literally rack up combos in the 50s and above. This, again, is thanks to the fluidity of the combat. I cannot emphasize enough how fun and effortless it is to build up a large combo in the game. You can go from unleashing a combo on one guy, to timing a counter perfectly on another, to cape dazing another, to ground and pounding a downed opponent. Combos also allow you to perform special moves. These are moves that become available after racking up a large enough combo score, which allow you to incapacitate one enemy or stun multiple. You can also use items in Batman's utility belt to take down enemies. Some of these include using a batarang to stun enemies, using your explosive bat gel as a trap to knock them out upon detonating, or use a bat claw to drag enemies off of balconies. So while easily hammering a few dozen thugs with your bare hands is both satisfying and logical, at least in context, the game does a good job of ramping up the difficulty by limiting the environment or supercharging your enemies. As you progress through the game, Joker's thugs will arm themselves with guns and knives, making one-on-one encounters next to impossible, and forcing Batman to stealthily take them down by sneaking up behind them or using the gargoyles mounted at the top of every room to string them up or jump down on them off guard. Guards will also eventually start rigging these gargoyles with explosives, eliminating them as a viable method of stealth movement. Just on this topic, these gargoyles are perhaps the biggest design misstep in the game. I get that they needed to give Batman a way to swing from position to position while in cramped indoor environments, but I felt like they could have done this in a much less conspicuous way. Another way the game racks up the difficulty is through enhanced enemies and boss battles. The enhanced enemies are Titan henchmen, regular thugs that have grown giant through the ingestion of the Titan formula. In order to beat them, you have to stun them using bat claws and cape swipes while laying into them with strikes while they're dazed. Do this enough and they'll take a knee, allowing Batman to grab them from behind, briefly controlling them while they swing blindly, which allows you to attack other enemies and increase your combo score. These are fun encounters that make innovative use of Batman's equipment and the combat mechanics. The boss fights are something of a mixed bag. Firstly, there really aren't that many. Secondly, they often rely on thugs or variations of thugs to make the encounters more difficult. And while it does make them more challenging, it's also a little bit overkill considering you spent the entire game fighting them anyway. A prime example of this is the Harley Quinn encounter. There are some good ones, like the Poison Ivy one. Even though she deploys henchmen under her control also, she at least uses varied attacks like poisonous spores and bone-crushing vines that appear from the ground while cocooned in a giant Venus flytrap, which by the way is a blatant rip-off of the Salazar boss in Resident Evil 4, but still fun nonetheless. The Killer Croc fight, however, is total shite. Taking place in the sewer, it actually had the potential to be one of the best fights in the game. The most physically imposing and intimidating of all the baddies in the game. Having a showdown in a maze that is a flooded sewer, which is Croc's domain, could have been a tense, lengthy and intricate affair, especially given that you had all your bat tools by this point relatively late in the game. Instead, it's just you tiptoeing on dodgy looking floating platforms in the middle of the water to retrieve some anti-venom, trying not to alert Croc to your location. And even if you do, when he emerges from the water and charges at you, all you have to do is hit him with one batarang and he falls back in. That's it. So, boss fights are not the game's strong point, but Arkham Asylum is such a consistently great game, it manages to produce one of its finest moments within the parameters of its weakest component. While in the morgue, Batman suffers what appears to be an hallucination. Unzipping 2 body bags, he finds the bodies of his dead parents, reanimated and asking him for help. Unzipping a 3rd one, he finds Scarecrow, the most compelling nemesis in the game. The Scarecrow takes control of Batman's mind and forces him to face his darkest fears. In this instance, it's reliving the murder of his parents. Turning back into a small child, Batman walks through the same alleyway where they were slain before entering Scarecrow's domain. An abyss with floating platforms. A giant Scarecrow stands in the middle while Batman must navigate around him. Get spotted and the encounter ends immediately, with the giant Scarecrow grabbing you. Get to the end of the platform unscathed and you'll reach a giant spotlight which you shine on Scarecrow, presumably as a metaphor for light shining through the darkness, which snaps Batman out of his trance and ends the boss. There are 3 of these encounters throughout the game, and they're all excellent. It's not because of the action per se, as you're just stealthily avoiding Scarecrow and pressing a button to shine a light on him. It's everything around it. The atmosphere, the visual art style, the deep look into Batman's psyche. The fact that it presents Scarecrow as not only an ever-present threat to Bruce Wayne, but as a real incarnation of the boogeyman who can control and manipulate the otherwise unshakable superhero. It also lends beautifully to the sense of dystopian dread that the game does such a great job of establishing. As I said before, Arkham is not a particularly big open world, but what it lacks in size it more than makes up for in hidden locations, challenges and character bios. The latter is further proof of Bioshock's influence. Many of the asylum's inhabitants have audio logs scattered around the asylum, which are recordings of the patient sessions with the asylum psychiatrists, which is basically the exact same as the audio logs found around Bioshock's City of Rapture. In them, we learn the disturbing backstories of the asylum's inhabitants, which, again, for someone like myself who knew nothing about someone like Zsasz or Scarecrow, really helps flesh out these characters, giving my real in-game encounters with them extra weight and significance. These audio diaries also do a great job of contextualizing these characters within the game itself. For example, they show how Harley Quinn goes from a naive yet legitimate psychiatric nurse in the asylum to the Joker's protege, as she gradually falls in love with him. All of the challenges come via the game's most omnipresent villain, the Riddler. Scattered throughout Arkham, these challenges come in the form of finding the aforementioned audio logs, Joker's teeth, physical trophies, and solving environmental riddles. The first 2 are basic enough, with you simply having to collect the trophies and audio logs and destroy the joke shop chattering teeth, which are Batarang. These are standard collect them all to 100% the game fare, and are just as addictive or monotonous as those found in any open world game. Obtaining many of the trophies is predicated upon navigating tricky environmental obstacles or upgrading your utility belt, which adds to the challenge and diminishes the tedium found in simply locating an item. Some of them are simply inaccessible unless you have access to certain gadgets or have upgraded them sufficiently. For example, certain items are impossible to reach without Batman's line launcher or explosive gel. The environmental riddles, however, are not only the best challenges, but are arguably the funnest part of the entire game, at least for me, and inarguably give the title its sense of longevity after the campaign is finished. These riddles can be divided into 2 categories. The first ones simply have to be scanned and are simply items or features in a room that coincide with the Riddler's hint. For example, in one of the rooms in the penitentiary, one of the clues is how do you reflect on your successes and failures, Batman? In the same room, there is a mirror. So if you scan the mirror with Batman in the frame, you'll solve the riddle. The game is also fairly strict about viewing and aligning these riddles correctly, which is a welcome challenge and means you won't just solve them by frequently and randomly scanning areas. Speaking of alignment, the other riddles are the most challenging and satisfying to solve. For simplicity, I'll just call them the question mark riddles. Basically, these are question marks painted all over Arkham which can only be seen, and therefore scanned, while the detective mode is on. Sounds simple enough. The only problem is that the period and the hook of the question mark are located in different places, meaning you have to position yourself correctly to align them. These range from relatively simple to ingeniously complex, with some of them being very difficult to find, never mind align. There are too many to recite, but I'll briefly mention one I found while we're playing this game which really made me laugh. There's an abandoned, half-demolished building on the grounds of the asylum. I found the period on the bottom of one of the floors, and could not for the life of me find the crook. After many minutes, I was ready to give up when, upon leaving the ruins, I spotted the crook underneath the top of the gothic, still standing main entrance to the dilapidated building. Positioning myself correctly, I was eventually able to align the two symbols together perfectly, 3 stories apart. The gradual increasing of your abilities and developing access to Arkham's various locations adds immeasurably to Arkham Asylum's pacing, which, if you've watched any of my videos before, is, in my opinion, one of the most important qualities in any story-driven game. Of course, said game's pacing can only be as good as its story, and how it unfolds over the duration of the campaign. The premise of Arkham Asylum is pretty straightforward. The Joker, who it turns out allowed himself to be caught, takes control over the asylum thanks to the help of his litany of incarcerated gang members and a corrupt cop. His motivation is gaining access to Penelope Young, a psychiatrist who has been developing a chemical called Titan on her patients. Titan is a more advanced version of the venom used to give Bane his super strength, and Young had been using it to allow her subjects to survive more strenuous therapies. However, seeing the potential in it, the Joker, who had been funding her research, allowed himself to be captured to gain access to Young and the Titan formula, intending to use it to create a race of superhuman monsters. This is basic comic book stuff and is hardly groundbreaking storytelling. However, the use of Titan, along with the Joker's control of Arkham, weaves nicely into the game's progression. The strength of the game's story isn't Joker's control or the Titan plot itself, that's basic. It's how it allows the game to gradually introduce new antagonists, more powerful enemies, and alter the environments, add new challenges, and prevent you from accessing certain areas without feeling like the game is cheating you or creating obvious invisible barriers. For example, when the Joker injects Poison Ivy with Titan, the powerful mutation allows her to mutate her plants, which completely ravages and takes over the asylum, effectively altering the entire map. She makes certain areas inaccessible and sprouts giant plants that shoot deadly spores at you. This forces you to carefully traverse the botanical gardens to confront Ivy, and only upon defeating her and re-imprisoning her do you halt her rampaging plant life, returning the asylum to normal, or relative normality at least. This is a somewhat obscure and extreme example, but is indicative of the game's great use of story, environment, and gameplay mechanics to add to its lore, atmosphere, and pacing. Batman Arkham Asylum is, in many ways, a forgotten gem. Overshadowed a few years later by its sequel Arkham City, and lost in the tide of classic open world games that would come out in the following decade, it's easy to forget just how enjoyable this game was. Replaying it all these years later, I was pleasantly surprised by the atmosphere, immersion, and pacing of this romp through Arkham's mental institution. Dripping with lore, Easter eggs, a litany of interesting characters, all wrapped up in a brooding package, it really has everything a story-driven game could want. Its sequel would surpass it in almost every single metric, and it doesn't quite have the breadth or staying power of other open-world titles. But still, Arkham Asylum is, in its own way, a classic.